Hello, my name is Teresa Piacentini and welcome to Lecture 3, Part 1 in Topic 2. And we will be looking at the presentation of self. And really the main aim of this first part of the lecture is to define Erving Goffman's approach to understanding of the self in everyday life and some of his key concepts. And really the first thing to say here is why Goffman? Well, Erving Goffman is largely considered one of the most brilliant and innovative sociological observers of daily life and of social interaction and the production of the self. His main focus has always been on micro-sociology, which is really an analysis of the meanings of everyday life through close observational work and intimate familiarity. He is interested in understanding underlying forms of human interaction societies and social structures. And he argued that we need both the micro, so this close up analysis, and the macro, so an understanding of wider society, to gain a fuller picture of what society is like. And this is really key. Goffman's perspective is really helpful in showing that self identity is constructed within interaction with others. So, in this sense, in his analysis, identity is always relational and always in process. It's constantly being constructed, maintained, and revised. And understanding this helps us understand the relationship between self and society. So, looking at Goffman's work, one of his key arguments is that individuals have both expressions that we give, so primarily the things we say and the intentional poses and facial expressions, so smiles or surprised looks, and other controlled body language we emit. So this is intentional. But we also have expressions we give off, and these are the elements of our expressiveness over which we have less control. So the inconsistencies between what we say and what we actually do, the body language that might give us away in some situations, and the expressions we give off are not intentional. Impression management then refers to the manipulation of cues to control and organize the expressions and therefore the impressions we give to others. And impression management theory, or the theoretical idea, serves to convey the appearance of conformity to social norms. The objective is to control how one is perceived by others. And in the 1959 sociological classic, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, Goffman clearly explains what he calls his dramaturgical perspective and the way in which our everyday lives so thoroughly mimic theatre. He draws its basic theme from a very famous line in Shakespeare: all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. So, according to Goffman, social life is a performance always. And the theatre, he argues, is an appropriate metaphor for this analysis of the routine interactions of everyday life. He detailed the kinds of sets and props and costumes and performances that constitute social life in an altogether new way. He dealt with the idea that we are all both audience and actor simultaneously, as even when we are observing, we're also fulfilling social roles. We take on multiple roles. He also indicated that our lives play out on not one, but many stages, and that part of our job as human actors is to manage our performances for the highest possible levels of coherence. He imagine social life in terms of the stage. So this is the dramaturgical approach. He talked about the front stage. So those public situations where performances take place. This might be the setting that has an audience and stage props. Performers know they are being observed, so they know they are on stage. And in this setting, our performance embodies certain standards. So Goffman talks about politeness and decorum, all of which are ways in which the performer treats the audience while engaged in talk or different types of interactions. He also talked about backstage. So this is the private or non-public situations where performances are prepared, where the impression fostered by the performance is knowingly contradicted, where the performer can reliably expect that no member of the audience will intrude. The backstage is characterised by a less formal atmosphere where the actors can openly and knowingly violate expected role behaviours. It's still a performance, he argues, but there's no audience, and this region is hidden. So if we think, for example, the front stage might be in a restaurant where if you have a part-time job in a cafe, you may be taking on the role as a waitress or a waiter, and so there are expectations of how you'll perform on the floor of the cafe or the restaurant when you're serving customers. Backstage may be the kitchen of the restaurant where you interact and chat and use language, and it's an embodied experience in a different way. He also talks about offstage. So offstage is an interaction that's independent of the stage of performance. So again, if there's a waiter you were to see all the time in your local cafe, and you bump into him or her at the supermarket, then this would be an offstage performance. You may still fulfill these kind of slightly awkward roles of knowing each other in a different setting. And this interaction, the performers might still be in character in some form when offstage, but it's not the same kind of interactions we have when it's front stage. So to sum up, these three settings provide a space to explore the multiplicity of roles that are performed in various contexts. Such performances involve individuals in continually monitoring the impressions they give off and make upon others. Our public identity is thus performed for an audience, Goffman argues, and we use our settings, so we use props and scripts to help us communicate our roles and manage impressions. An important part of this is the need for all of the people involved in any one social interaction to have some shared understanding of what is going on and what the expectations are. Goffman doesn't think that we can discuss people's selves abstracted from their social situations, and he writes in this quote that the self does not derive from its possessor, but from the whole scene of his action. The self is a product of the scene, so the self is a product of the place of interaction, the context of interaction, and the other people involved. It is a performed character in a particular moment. Goffman's arguing here that the self arises in the very process of performance, which is reliant upon interaction. And what is crucial is a recognition that for Goffman, talking about the individual as some sort of autonomous agent is incorrect. Rather, the individual should be thought of always in relationship to a social whole. And this is at the core of impression management, which is simply one's opportunity to try and control what others see and or know about us. It is crucial, Goffman argues, to identity management. And it's important to understand that according to Goffman, this is something we all do more or less successfully all of the time. So what Goffman means here is that the self is always relational, it is always situational, it is fluid, and so it changes in different contexts, and it is produced through the performance of a role. Goffman also argues that the self is dictated by what he calls self-presentation goals. And really what he says is that this is what is pushing us in our presentation of self in everyday life. We want to achieve personal goals, we want to give off a positive view of ourselves, and there is a level of conformity to social norms, so accepted types of behaviour. Goffman's dramaturgical metaphor points to the different rules and expected behaviours, or scripts, as he calls them, that help us achieve our self-presentation goals that we follow no matter what stage we are on. That is, how the actor should behave or interact in that situation. Scripts, Goffman argues, are vital to interpersonal interaction, and they allow us to do this. They allow us to give the best account of ourselves. They allow a maintenance of some kind of social order, and they help us act as we think is generally accepted in society. And what I'd like to do now is look at some examples of how Sociologists have used Goffman's metaphor of the dramaturgical metaphor and applied it to different types of contexts where there is a performance of the self in everyday life. In this paper by Colette, she is looking at motherhood, actually, and the impression management of motherhood in interactions. She uses a combination of participant observation of a playgroup setting and interviews with mothers of young children to describe, hear, and investigate mothers' concerns about when and with whom to manage impressions, and the impressions that the women interviewed hope to portray through the physical appearance of their children. So it's a micro-sociological perspective, and it's very revealing about a number of important questions relating to, amongst other things, social status, positioning, class, cultural capital, and social capital. Some of the things that Colette found were that name brand baby clothes and public and private appearances, so how children appear in the home setting and how they might appear in this type of playgroup setting, are seen as a reflection of what the interviewees called good mothering. So they were symbols of competence and coping with motherhood. Well-dressed babies reflected selfless mothers, so a full embracement of this role and some kind of image of self-sacrifice, so them giving up for themselves so that their children appear in their best possible way. And the appearance of babies in labelled clothing, for example, projected and enhanced the impression of the mother in others' eyes. So this was absolutely about impression management. Colette explores this idea of spoiled identities, and particularly interesting, I think, and revealing is the difference between, for example, old dirt and new dirt. So old dirt of clothes that haven't been washed, that have maybe food stains on them, or are a couple of days old, was seen as bad, whereas new dirt, so dirt that maybe from playing in the mud, could be seen as good. Right, so one is seen as almost a measure of neglect and the other is seen as being normal. And so these were part of the kind of props and settings and costumes that were used to manage this impression management. And actually the children themselves became also props in their impression management strategies. So in this study of how mothers confirm their own identities through impression management, but what's interesting is it's not really of themselves, but through the management of their children's appearances. And in this second study of middle-class mothers' narratives on their daily routines of preparing lunch boxes for their children, and we can see this as an image from a photo diary that was used as a method for this project, for this piece of research. In the lunch boxes, the middle-class mothers performed their version of the identity of good mothering, ensuring balanced and nutritious diets. They performed this practice of good mothering daily through the content of their children's lunch boxes, but also in the photos they provided. And this is an example of a photo diary. And in one of the pictures, an interviewee called Olivia took part and submitted this. And if we look closely, we can see a picture of Jamie Oliver's book, Ministry of Food, positioned behind a lunchbox. It's almost as if the celebrity chef himself is towering over its contents, offering approval, with the words fruit and veg visible on the chopping board at the bottom. We can see there's a glass jar of homemade sourdough, which was not part of the lunchbox, but appeared in the picture. Now, the inclusion of this could be by chance, or it could be read as an attempt at impression management. Olivia should be seen differently to the other problematic mothers that featured in her narratives, and here she is doing her very best to prepare a healthy, balanced diet. Now, what's interesting in both these studies are the notions of good and bad mothering as understood through performance. And we can only really understand this through the micro-sociological perspective that is characteristic of Goffman. Harman and Cappellini, who wrote this article, argue that their findings suggest that mothers were displaying to themselves, as well as external audiences, such as school teachers and lunchtime supervisors, and the researchers, that they are competent and caring mothers. Colette finds similar findings through the display of appearance of dress and cleanliness. So it's not just about what we do, but what this tells others about us. And I think both these studies really illuminate well the crucial role of the perceived audience in the process of this display. And this goes back to what Goffman says, is the performance always requires an audience. And the audience in these examples would be themselves, other parents, people in the school. Mothers in these two studies didn't want to position themselves as problematic by not following school guidance or as accepting good dirt. So they were performing to someone. And impression management and the value of the dramaturgical perspective necessitates this audience. And in this slide, what I'd like you to do is pause here and go to the topic 2 storyboard and watch this clip. And we can see that it is an image of Mike Myers and Kanye West. And it's a still from a tele fundraiser in 2005 to support people who suffered as a result of Hurricane Katrina, which was an extremely destructive and deadly cyclone, tropical cyclone that was one of the costliest natural disasters in the US. And so this is from a telethon fundraiser where there was a teleprompted script where they are to relay the extent of the disaster and provide information about the Red Cross's efforts to address the devastation. So please pause and watch this. And what we can see happening here is Mike Myers reads a teleprompt, but Kanye West goes completely off script. And it's not just the written script he decides not to follow, but the social script. He delivers a very public, so a front stage performance, biting critique against the mainstream media's portrayal of the predominantly poor African Americans most devastated by Katrina, and the poorly organised and disinterested government response, and also against then President George W. Bush for failing to address the needs of this marginalised and vulnerable community. The opportunity for embarrassment here is really heightened. Myers tries to manage the situation. He's uncomfortable, he's fidgety, he's awkward, but he continues as if nothing is happening. West doesn't follow the rules of social interaction as he gives Myers little assistance and in fact creates more tension with his explicit accusation George Bush doesn't care about black people. So we can see that this is actually what Goffman calls going off script, and it is indeed a kind of terrifying moment that's palpable for West because of his own self-presentation motives, right? He wants to give the best account of himself, but he's using this as a way of enacting social change and a breakaway from the routines and narratives that are being told and retold that actually foster inequalities. So going off script, although this is an interesting clip to watch, we can see that it is something that is very scary, which partly explains why we tend not to do it. And the last slide I want to look at in this clip is really around this question of roles and socialization, because for Goffman, in everything we do, we play roles, and the roles we play are central to negotiating the relationship between self and society. So he talks about role analysis as an attempt to understand the relationship between individuals and the behaviours expected of them. These roles and expectations may be a constraint and a resource to be manipulated. And we can break this down. So there are multiple roles that are understood as the way in which individuals fit into a particular situation and in each interaction. We perform many roles at the same time, and this means we also have several selves. Goffman talks about the individual as a juggler and synthesizer of these different roles, an accommodator and an appeaser, so we wear different masks depending on the situation. And the roles we take up are regulated by the rules and norms of social interaction. And we occupy these roles through status cues, so how we dress, our manner, or role terms, perhaps terms of reference and address. We can also think about role embracement, so to embrace a role is to be fully seen in terms of the image and to conform expressively one's acceptance of it. We adhere to everything that role demands, and we tend to embrace the roles seen as institutional representatives and play out the role in cherished detail, perhaps as a new parent, for example. Then we also have role segregation, so individuals act out multiple roles, but usually in different contexts and not at the same time or with the same groups of other people. For example, an easygoing parent may be a hard taskmaster, but what happens when these worlds collide? And sometimes it's hard to know exactly how to act. Certain behaviours and ideas are appropriate to only particular audiences in our lives, not all. And audience segregation is essentially the effort to compartmentalise our relationships for the sake of clear impression management. And really, this emphasises the importance of context that shapes how we perform and any segregation rules in everyday action. And finally, just looking at role conflict and role distance, conflict arises in situations where individuals find themselves potentially playing more than one role at the same time. So this leads to role dilemmas. And that can result in role distance. So it might be an attempt by an individual to introduce some distance between the role and the self. I'm acting out this role, but it's not the real me. It's almost a pretense of detachment. I'm much more than this simple role, or how I am behaving is because of this role. And this separateness can also lead to a kind of resistance to the role. So that brings us to the end of part one. And in part two, we'll be looking at how Goffman's work has been debated.